Hi everyone, a very good afternoon. And on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAS, at the National University of Singapore, I welcome you to today's ISAS seminar on Sino-Pakistani Relations, Politics, Military and Regional Dynamics. The seminar will examine the political and military dynamics behind the Sino-Pakistani relations the last 20 years. Among others, it will also look at the wider trends in the relationship, as well as the evolution and implementation of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. We're very delighted to have as our guest speaker, Dr. Filippo Boni, lecturer in Politics and International Studies at the Open University in the United Kingdom. And Dr. Boni is the author of the book Sino-Pakistani Relations, Politics, Military and Regional Dynamics. And welcome to the session, Dr. Boni. And moderating today's seminar is Dr. Yogesh Joshi, Research Fellow at ISAS, and Dr. Joshi's research focuses on contemporary Indian foreign and national security policy with an emphasis on the Indo-Pacific's balance of power, the evolution of India's military power, and its approach to the use of force in international relationships. And I shall now pass the session to Dr. Joshi. Dr. Joshi, please.
Thank you, Sidara, for that introduction. And welcome all of you. Good afternoon and welcome all of you from not only in Singapore, but from all across the world. We have a very exciting talk today, which focuses on one of the most interesting and sophisticated relationship, not only in South Asia, but in the larger Asian region as such. Dr. Filippo Boni, who Sidara introduced, is going to talk about his recent book, on Sino-Pakistan Entente Cordiale. This book is an interesting take on Sino-Pakistani relationship because for the first time it seems that it analyzes the Sino-Pakistani relationship from the framework of civil-military relations and the predominance of Pakistani military as the most important and powerful interest group, determining not only internal Pakistani politics, but also its foreign policy. The Sino-Pakistani relationship is important for a number of reasons. First of all, in South Asia as a region, this is the closest to an alliance relationship which you can find. We don't see that kind of strong alliance relationships, at least informally, in the whole of South Asian region. The second reason is that China has invested heavily in Pakistani politics, economy, and military. And this is like no other relationship in its foreign policy. And the BRI, which is one of the case studies in Dr. Boni's book, kind of looks about how China's invested so much of economic and diplomatic effort into the Sino-Pakistani relationship. And lastly, it is also important for the emerging landscape in South Asia, but also worldwide, the impending clash between the declining hegemon, which is the US, and the rising power globally, which is China, but also for the larger region of Indo-Pacific. And therefore, without much ado, I'm gonna give the floor to Dr. Boni, except for one housekeeping remark. Please submit your questions directly to ISA staff. We will collect those questions and raise those questions to Dr. Boni after he ends his presentation. Dr. Boni, over to you now.
Thank you so much. And thanks very much for the warm introduction. I'll start sharing the screen as I have a few slides that I hope you can see it clearly. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure joining you this afternoon or this morning here in London. I'm really delighted to be giving this talk at the Institute of South Asian Studies, and thanks very much for the invitation. So today's talk is, as you were saying, really focuses on a subject that I've been studying since 2013, and which has evolved at a very rapid pace on all sorts of levels, local, regional, as well as global. Just to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about over the next 20 to 25 minutes, brief introduction. I will then sort of set out the approach that I take in the study of China-Pakistan relations and why it is important to look at it, in my opinion, through the lens of domestic politics. I will provide a brief snapshot of the structure, framework, and methods that I've used in the book, which in part will also form the main bulk of the discussion in the empirical parts of today's presentation. I will then outline some of the trends that we see in the relationship over the last 20 years, because I think it's important to contextualize some of the present dynamics also at the beginning of the 21st century, where some of the trends that we see today really ground their roots. And then I will zoom in one of the 3 case studies that I look at in the book, which is the China-Pakistan economic corridor, looking at the domestic and regional implications of CPEC, before trying to draw some conclusions, both on the way ahead as far as CPEC is concerned, but also in general on China-Pakistan relations as they currently stand. So the fact that Sino-Pakistan relations, as Dr. Joshi was mentioning in his introductory remarks, has been really an extremely interesting relationship and at the center of a number of debates. An example is this headline, which comes from a Bloomberg report at the end of last year, which was essentially looking at the way in which the corridor was being implemented. And it portrayed, in my view, a bit of an unfair characterization of how things were being deployed on the ground, as I will explain also in the next parts of the presentation. But still, it was quite a piece of reporting. But beyond the more specific details of CPEC, I think that Pakistan has been one of the key flashpoints in which the relationship, the global competition between the US and China has really played out. And this was very much evident when we heard about the remarks at the end of last year by the Ambassador Alice Wells on the China-Pakistan economic corridor, in which she was raising concerns about the debt sustainability, the transparency, in what were quite stark remarks as far as CPEC was concerned. These were immediately rejected by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the Pakistani Foreign Ministry, but I think this gives us an indication beyond the specificities of this episode about how important Pakistan and the China-Pakistan economic corridor is in the wider geopolitical trend, not just regionally, but also globally. And as far as the more academic side of the debate is concerned, there was an interesting article which was published in Contemporary South Asia at the end of last year again, which was in a way questioning Pakistan's decision to align ever more closely to China and thereby drifting away progressively from the United States. And it's a rather agile piece, which I would sort of recommend reading, because it enriches the debate around the strategic choices that Pakistan is facing today. So what I hope this brief introduction shows is that the debate is really multi-layered, and it touches on a number of areas which are the same ones in a way that I will sort of look at in my presentation today. Before we move on to actually discuss about the book and the more empirical discussion, I think it's important to set out why, in my work in general, I look at China-Pakistan relations through the prism of Pakistan's domestic politics. I think this is important for 3 main reasons. First of all, the relationship between Pakistan and China, especially since 2013, it's a relationship which really transcends the exclusive foreign policy dimension and really has expanded into a wide range of areas that are of interest for in the Pakistani domestic scenario. So it would be really reductive to treat it as an exclusive foreign policy dimension. The second aspect, which I think it's important to look at this relationship through this specific prism, is because since the advent of the BRI, what we've seen is that this applies to Pakistan, but it's a broader point, I think, that most of the BRI countries, those countries where China's invested under the Belt and Road Initiative's umbrella, has been seen as passive recipients of Chinese investment. And a number of analyses that thereby neglected the complex realities of the decision-making process on the ground, which I think are actually quite important. And some of these I will try to unearth in the ensuing parts of the presentation. And third, because it helps bring to the fore the domestic political context, and especially the way in which these projects have been internalized in the domestic politics of BRI recipient countries. So it's not just a matter that these the investment is parachuted and then it happens. No, it's actually what we've seen is that CPEC has really become a regular staple in most of the discussions that we see in the newspapers, whether it's about the economic dimension, whether it's about the political control of the project. So I think it's really important to look at these aspects further. To this end, what I do in the book is to analyze 3 case studies: the development of the port of Gwadar, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and the relationship between China and Pakistan in the Afghan scenario. And the main focus of the empirical chapters is between 2000 and 2018, although there's also an historical chapter, a background chapter, which places all these dynamics into the wider context of the historical trajectory that the relationship has taken. And for each of these areas, I've sort of divided each of these case studies into 4 decision-making areas, namely economic policy, elite recruitment, internal security, and foreign policy. And for each of these areas, through the Heidelberg model of civilian control, I have looked at the extent of military influence in the decision-making process. So for today's presentation, I will mostly, for questions of time and to leave enough space at the end for the Q&A, I will primarily look at the China-Pakistan economic corridor as a case study, but I mean, happy to take questions on the other ones as well. Before we move on, just a quick note on the methodology. The book and the empirical analysis in the book, it's primarily based on semi-structured elite interviews that I've conducted in Pakistan between 2015 and 2018. And these, of course, have been triangulated with primary and secondary sources, some of which are also included in today's presentation. So before we dive into the China-Pakistan economic corridor and the various decision-making areas and how they're playing out in the context of CPEC, I think it's important to take a step back to contextualize what we see today. Because in the early 2000s, we really find the origin of some of the trends that characterize the relationship as we see it today. The first one is the development of the port of Gwadar, which started in 2001. The first phase was officially completed in 2006. Between 2008 and 2013 was handed over to the Port of Singapore Authority. It didn't really work for a number of reasons, and then it was in 2013, it was handed over to the China Overseas Ports Holding Company, which has managed the port ever since. What I think it's interesting here is that one of the trends is that the first phase was developed through a grant from China, and this is an element that we find in the financing of CPEC as well. Most of the projects in Gwadar are being developed through a grant or through interest-free loans, which I think it's an indication also of the importance that this project has in the wider relationship between Pakistan and China. The second one is that discussion about the economic, the second trend that I think it's important to contextualize is that discussions about the economic corridor really started under General Musharraf's rule. And at the time, the idea was essentially twofold. On the one hand, make the most out of Pakistan's geographic location in order to act as a bridge for China to the oil-rich Arabian Peninsula. But at the same time, for Pakistan, developing a corridor for Pakistan would have meant having access to the Central Asian markets as well. And sort of the preparations, if you like, for the development of the corridor really continued under the PPP government and eventually saw the light when the BRI was announced and when the PMLN came to power in 2013. So this is the second trend. And the third one is the signing of the free trade agreement in 2006. It became officially, it started working officially in 2007. And I think it's important because we just saw after years of negotiations, the second phase being agreed from in 2019, and it became effective from 1st of January 2020. So the economic relationship which starts really building up. But if we wanted to capture the evolution of China-Pakistan relations over the past years, I think these two charts give us an indication of where to look. The first one is the arms exports to Pakistan from China and the US. And as we see, apart from 4 years, China has been the major arms supplier to Pakistan. And this has been especially the case since 2011, so in the last 9 years. Simultaneously, what we see is that the relationship where the economic dimension was very minimal at the beginning of the 21st century. What we see is that it started progressively developing, both because of the free trade agreement, but at the same time, we see a dramatic increase also in the trade imbalance, which is highly tilted in China's favor since 2013, when the first MOUs for CPEC were officially signed. So strong defense partnership, which has been sort of the backbone of Sino-Pakistani relations over the years, to which the economic dimension has been added, to which the economic dimension has been attached. So, I'd be happy to discuss a little bit more about this in the Q&A. So why am I looking at CPEC specifically? Because I think it has become impossible, especially since 2013, to sort of decouple China-Pakistan relations from the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Most of the developments in the relationship have been, to a certain extent, or in one way or the other, related and linked to the China-Pakistan economic corridor. If we were to provide a snapshot of what CPEC is today, or at least what the early harvest projects of CPEC are, these two pictures can give us a good indication. The first one is the Port Qasim power plant in Sindh. It's been built under the early harvest projects. And the second one is the Orange Line, which is a mass transportation project in Lahore. So energy and infrastructure really were at the heart of CPEC at the beginning. CPEC was defined as the flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative by Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. The original estimates in 2015 were of around $46 billion overall of investment. In 2017, these were revised upwards and went up to 62 billion. What we actually see from data from the Planning Commission tells us that we have around 20 billion of projects either completed or under construction at the moment. And as I've mentioned, the lion's share of the early harvest projects, so the ones to be completed on a priority basis, was on energy and infrastructure. So what I'm going to do over the next few slides, I will look at the different decision-making areas that I've outlined at the beginning of the presentation. So economic policy, elite recruitment, internal security, before moving to the foreign policy dimension. Starting from economic policy, I think this is quite an interesting area for two reasons. First of all, the framework, the cooperation framework between Pakistan and China as part of the CPEC and the BRI, it's one of the most institutionalized that we see across the board. The main decision, the chief decision-making body is the Joint Cooperation Committee, which brings together the Ministry of Planning, Development and Reform on the Pakistani side and the National Development and Reform Commission on the Chinese side. The JCC, as this infographic shows, is organized around a number of joint working groups, some of which have been added also during the recent visit of the Pakistani president to China. So very institutionalized on the one hand. What I think it's also interesting is to look at the domestic politics behind the control over economic policy. And this has been at the center of disagreements between civilian and military authorities, especially under the PMLN government, where the debate was really polarized between, on the one hand, the PMLN, who wanted to maintain its civilian control over the decision-making process, and the desire of the military to gain greater control. And the evolution of these dynamics, I think, is really interesting, because in the past couple of years, what we've seen has been a progressive dilution of civilian control with the establishment of the CPEC authority and the creation of the National Development Council And the CPEC authority in particular, it's currently headed by a retired 3-star general. So I think this gives us an indication of where the trend in terms of military influence is going. Another area which I look at in the book, it's elite recruitment. So we see that key institutions and agencies which are tasked with the implementation of CPEC have at the helm and are headed by civilian officials, whether it's the JCC or the National Highway Authority, which is one of the main agencies tasked with building the infrastructure projects under the BRI, under CPEC. But at the same time, what we see is that the CPEC authority, as I've mentioned before, is headed by a retired military official. And overall, the narrative of CPEC's advancement and protection has really been mostly brought forward by the military. And I think this is an interesting aspect, especially since yesterday it was in the news that the head of the CPEC authority has also become the special advisor to the Prime Minister on information and broadcasting. So this is where these two aspects really start going hand in hand. Internal security, I think it's another area which it's particularly interesting to see how the domestic dynamics behind it play out. First of all, it has a number of components. The land component, we saw the establishment of a special security division in the Pakistani army, and there were reports that another division was being raised. There is also a maritime component where the Pakistan Navy established the Task Force 88 from seaward threats, Force Protection Battalion, which is a segment of the Pakistani Marines, which is stationed in Gwadar, the Coastal Security and Harbor Defense Force, which protects the Makran coast around Gwadar. And there's been also reports of uses of private security contractors through joint ventures on specific CPEC projects. At the same time, there is also a digital component, which I think is particularly interesting as well, with the development during the early harvest projects of the fiber optic cable, which costed around $38 million and was again developed by the Special Communications Organization and also the Smart Cities project. So the idea of creating safer urban areas within Pakistan, and some of the equipment to develop these projects was coming from Chinese companies. So I think this is, what this shows is that also in this case, what we see is that the strong presence, the military presence in the decision-making process, I think it's pretty clear. This sort of brief overview of how domestic politics in Pakistan works around CPEC cannot avoid discussing very briefly the impact that CPEC has had on Pakistan's federalism. And I think this is something that I discuss in the book, but it's also drawing on research which is forthcoming, actually should be out in the next few weeks, which is co-authored with Professor Catherine Aden at the University of Nottingham, where we sort of looked at the number at the impact that the China-Pakistan economic corridor had on federalism. And some of the main findings is that the early harvest projects were mostly along the sort of eastern route, which is the one in red on the map that you can see here on the slides. The vast majority of the projects in this first phase were concentrated in Sindh and Punjab, and these are also the ones that have been completed first. If we look, and this is all data which comes from the Planning Commission. This is official data, and then which has been triangulated, of course, with other interviews and other sources. The reasons behind this, the sort of prioritization of one part over the other, and I'd be happy to discuss about this a bit more in the Q&A, is that there are a number of potential explanations that we found. One is that the PMLN's base, the former government, was in Punjab, but at the same time that China had expressed the clear desire to work on some of the areas which were already developed. So where Punjab and Sindh were a bit more industrialized already than other parts of Pakistan. I think this, again, I'm talking about this briefly just to give you an overview, but happy to discuss about it a bit more. As far as the regional dimension is concerned, what I think it's interesting to notice, it's a couple of things. First of all, what we see is that according to a number of studies looking at how economic corridors work and where they have worked and how to make the most out of economic corridors, one thing is clear, is that they have to be integrated within the region and in the sort of networks within the region. So I think it's important to try and make sense whether CPEC is actually integrated in its region and the current geopolitical conditions, whether these are conducive to a better integration. And on this note, I think that the assessment is not particularly positive. India and CPEC, there have been a number of concerns raised by India. First of all, sovereignty issues, as according to policymakers in New Delhi, the China-Pakistan economic corridor goes through Gilgit-Baltistan. In addition, there have been constant fears of Gwadar as a potential military base, which I don't think we see the signs of this as of now. But still, it's a long-standing concern that the military partnership between Pakistan and China represent a threat to India, and overall the sense that CPEC and Sino-Pakistani relations are a counterbalance to India's regional influence, including Afghanistan, which is one of the other case studies that I look at in the book and that I will discuss briefly now. So what we see is that since 2014, there's been a renewed diplomatic push from Beijing in the Afghan scenario, whether it was by hosting the Heart of Asia Istanbul process in 2014, or by appointing a special envoy to Afghanistan, or establishing a consultation mechanism at the foreign ministers level between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So I think this demonstrates how China has been willing to be more proactive in the Afghan scenario. And try to mediate between Pakistan and Afghanistan, whose relations, though, are still following the sort of past trajectories rather than a new approach. And for this reason, I think that although there are discussions of extending some of the CPEC networks and projects to Afghanistan, for the very reason that I was mentioning at the beginning of this second part of the presentation. So economic corridors need to be integrated in the region, and the links need to be strong in order for this to function properly. I don't think that this is something which is likely to happen in the immediate future, because the political conditions are really not there. So to wrap up and to couple of concluding remarks, one on the a few on the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and then on where I see that the relationship between Pakistan and China is at the moment, and where I think it's going. CPEC, I think that to an extent projects, what we've seen, have slowed down. This is, of course, has been denied, but I think we've seen a slower pace than we saw in the previous phase, in part because, of course, of the global pandemic, but also because there were some difficulties in agreeing on a way forward, especially at the beginning of the PTI's mandate. One example of this is how the 9th Joint Cooperation Committee in a way, didn't include any new projects, but the focus was more on small-scale social development ones, in line with the priorities set out by the PTI during their election campaign and in the first year since they're in power. And I think also it's interesting to notice how the establishment of the CPEC authority is a sign of a number of things. First of all, the strategic importance of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and as I've mentioned previously, of dilution that we see of civilian control over the project. But at the same time, there is really the desire to speed up implementation and to keep the momentum behind the China-Pakistan economic corridor going. So that's really this is one of the main aims behind the creation of the CPEC authority. And then we can discuss whether it's actually functional to do this through another layer of bureaucracy or not. On the wider Sino-Pakistani relationship, I think that what we see is that it's probably still at one of its highest peaks that we've seen in history because of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. But at the same time, political agendas seem to be slightly less aligned now than they were under the PMLN government. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship it's going under any sort of stress test. The fundamentals are quite solid. What we saw at the end of last month, the visit of the Pakistani president to Beijing, I think, is a testament and a clear indication of solidarity from Pakistan to China. And CPEC was on the cards because the Minister for Planning and Development was part of the delegation which visited China. So CPEC is omnipresent in the bilateral interactions, but at the same time, I think the relationship is well on track overall. And defense cooperation, as one of the charts that I've included at the beginning of the presentation demonstrated, I think defense cooperation still is largely the backbone of Sino-Pakistani ties to present. So I think I'll stop here, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Boni, for that very illuminating discussion on Sino-Pakistani relations. I think you have elaborated on the dynamics which has unfolded in the last 20 years, and where not only in terms of different groups and different causal mechanisms which are driving this relationship into a new direction, but also laid out the implications of this, not only for India, but for the larger global audience, so to say. Taking this discussion forward and drawing upon your extensive fieldwork both in China and Pakistan, which I think went into the making of this book, I have initially two questions to ask you. So it appears that the Sino-Pakistani relationship kind of formed around military balances and this regional security architecture which both Pakistan and China wanted to create, not only in South Asia, but otherwise, for almost like 50 years, from late 1950s till maybe towards the end of 2000s. What led to the redirection of this relationship in early 2010s from being just focused on military and foreign policy matters to a broad-based economic, political, domestic linkages? So what were the motivations both for China and Pakistan to redirect this relationship in the way they have done in the past 1 decade or so? The second thing which I want you to kind of talk to us about, since you have done so much of field work both in China and Pakistan, is there, so what kind of a domestic consensus do we have in Pakistan on CPEC? It appears from the outside that yes, there is a very broad-based consensus. But if you remember correctly, when Imran Khan was fighting for elections to become Prime Minister, he had some misgivings about the CPEC. There are always concerns about transparency, debt issues, environmental problems, the issues of division of resources, the federalism, the federal structure of Pakistan, which you talked about, but also what it means for how these resources are distributed within the very many interest groups in Pakistan. So I would start with those two questions, and then we'll take others.
Thank you very much. These excellent questions, and they could be the topic of a separate presentation altogether. I'll try to answer briefly. I think that what led to the redirection, I think it's an excellent question. I think there are two trends and two potential explanations here. One is what we see after the raid in Abbottabad, which killed Osama bin Laden in 2011. What we really see is that a progressive shift of Pakistan away from the United States and closer to China. But it's not just closer to China, I think. There is also, and this is something that I think it's interesting to look out for, we've seen a growing relationship, for instance, between Pakistan and Russia, which really starts developing, and the first approach and reach out occurred around 2011, 2012, and then it has become progressively a relationship which is worth keeping under the radar. As for the way in which it is developing, again, there too, defense partnership first, few military exercises, and then the economic component is being attached to it. So I think this is one potential explanation. The other one is that there was really an alignment of political will in 2013. We had coming to power the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, the PMLN, very focused on trying to boost industrialization. It campaigned extensively on the agenda of ending electricity shortages in the country. And the announcement of the BRI was the perfect moment and really the perfect combination. So there was a fertile environment on the ground in the recipient country and political will on Chinese side to make the most out of it. So I think this is something which played out quite nicely in trying to explain why after 2011 and not before. So as far as domestic consensus is concerned, that's another excellent question. I think that there was a survey conducted by Gallup Poll Pakistan in 2017, according to which 85% of those surveyed were saying that CPEC was good, whether either somewhat good or very good for the country. So the vast majority seems to be there. What we don't have is the provincial breakdown of these wider trends and of this wider support. So I think it would be interesting, and this is something that it's definitely worth looking into it a little bit more, is to see, we've heard about concerns, especially from the regarding the alignment of the China-Pakistan economic corridor and the prioritization of Sindh and Punjab over Baluchistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and there have been concerns expressed regarding to this. So the domestic consensus, I think, it's largely there. It's largely there, with few exceptions. The ones that I've just outlined.
Right.
I hope this answers your questions.
Sure. So one of the most fascinating part of this book, as I was reading through the initial chapters, is that you focus on the Pakistani military as an interest group, driving the Pakistani politics and redirecting this relationship, and basically being the driving force behind CPEC, and which you brought out in your presentation as well. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the mechanisms which the military has used in kind of furthering the CPEC as the redirection which Sino-Pakistan relationship has to take, and what it says about Pakistani democracy, so to say.
I think that the role of the Pakistani military has been has been very preeminent. It's really a case, in some cases and during some periods, I mean, I didn't, of course, have the time to cover it all, but the 4 decision-making areas are assessed over a period of 20 years. So there are clearly variations, right, across the time frame selected. In some cases, what we saw was a sort of cohabitation between the civilian and military decision-making process. At times, we would find greater military influence. Under the PMLN, I would argue that economic policy, you would find a bit more elected officials' influence, if you like. So I think that varied quite a bit. So the way in which I mean, China has also been very comfortable dealing with the host of actors that operate on the Pakistani political scenes. That's without any doubt. But at the same time, they've been always very comfortable dealing as well with the Pakistani military. So I think that there's also a connection there which should not be underestimated in trying to explain the sort of continuity in ties between the two countries.
Right. Taking forward, looking at just the domestic politics of Pakistan and taking this argument of how CPEC kind of impacts the domestic politics of Pakistan.
Yes.
So, in some sense, at the end of the day, it's about redistribution of resources which accrue from these foreign policy changes. And those redistribution of resources would not be equitable across the board, particularly, in restive provinces like Balochistan and Sindh, for that matter, compared to Punjab. And there are local communities both in Balochistan, Gilgit-Baltistan, as well as Sindh, which kind of feel that they would be left out from this, this redirection and the kind of resources it would accrue to the Pakistani states. Are there more cleavages within the Pakistani polity, particularly pertaining to how the resources which would accrue from China-Pakistan, this redirection in their relationship and the CPEC would be divided among these interest groups? And would it lead to kind of, more domestic unrest in Pakistan, so to say?
I don't think, I'm not sure that that's the direction where this is going. I think that the cleavages that you mentioned are clearly there. And they are, they are to an extent at the local level, but also elites have expressed their concerns regarding allocation of projects. And CPEC has been very much at the heart of some of the controversies that have characterized the political debate in the past few years. At the same time, my sense is that, and this is something that I've briefly touched on in the conclusions, what I think we see now is that some of the concerns and there is a growing realization that unless the local ownership, it's really included as one of the key elements and key factors of CPEC, it would be very difficult to move things forward at the pace that is desired by both sides. So my sense is that now with the greater focus on social development and projects like Vocational Training Institute in Gwadar, a hospital, yes, they come, if you like, late to the picture, because CPEC has been, the first MOUs were signed in 2013, officially launched in 2015. So we're 5 years down the line. So probably, the concerns that of the marginalization to an extent were in a way justifiable. But at the same time, I think that now we saw a progressive shift towards more of this kind of dimension and projects, for the very reason that local ownership, it's a key component. Without it, it's difficult to move things forward.
Right. So you mentioned the Gallup poll and the popular perception, the popular consensus being in favor of CPEC. So what are the kinds of mechanisms which both Pakistan and China are deploying in local Pakistani, environment to kind of create a more popular consensus for the relationship with China? We know now that Mandarin is basically being made mandatory in Pakistani schools, for that matter. But Pakistani society, more or less, has been a post-colonial society which has always looked towards the West rather than towards China in terms of popular engagement. And how is the CPEC changing that outlook of Pakistani society, so to say?
I think that's an excellent question. I think that the look west element, I think it's very much there still. At the same time, what the CPEC will probably, I'm not sure I have a definitive answer on this, but my sense is that what we probably see in and it's one of the other components which really needs to be added to the relationship. It's the people-to-people dimension and relations, right? So far has been mostly at the elite level. As the populations of countries start interacting together more and more, that's probably something that we will see playing out in much greater detail. There have been, China's offered a good number of scholarships for Pakistani students to study in China. There have been initiatives to bring together Chinese and Pakistani cultures to get to know each other a bit more. So I think that's something which is being developed, but it's probably, it's coming after the sort of priorities of energy generation, transport, infrastructure, and so on and so forth.
Right. No, thank you for those thoughts. The other thing which is very interesting is that China is always bothered by the export of extremist ideologies, particularly in Xinjiang, and Pakistan being a haven for it. Do you think CPEC as a pacification project, so to say, where China could elevate the economic, social status of the Pakistanis and kind of redirect some of that, extremism, which directly influences China? So the larger question is that, how does China see the content and the substance of CPEC impacting some of the extremism which is coming out of Pakistan?
I think that's one of the key motivations, one of the reasons why we see the China-Pakistan economic corridor as well being developed. The idea was really to stabilize China's Western periphery through economic development, assuming then that economic development would bring social stability. I mean, and to an extent, and this is again, thanks to the efforts of the Pakistani society and the Pakistani armed forces as well, what we found when CPEC was officially announced, when the first MOUs were signed in 2013, Pakistan had roughly 5,200 or around, give or take, fatalities from terrorist incidents in the country. Last year, I think it was less than 300. So I think that there is an element to that, which we cannot disregard. I think it's actually very central to the way and to the motives behind Chinese decision to invest in Pakistan. What will be interesting is and it relates again back to what I was saying in my presentation, whether this can be extended to Afghanistan as well. But again, I think it's still relatively unlikely.
Sure. Sure. So one of the things which has often come out, not only in terms of the gigantic nature of this enterprise which CPEC is, but whether Pakistan can actually follow up on the promise of CPEC. So whether the internal capabilities of Pakistan state can actually, lead to an overall successful conclusion of this project. And are there misgivings both on the Pakistani side as well as the Chinese side of whether they can really pull this off? And I would like you to kind of think about it in terms of the current situation of COVID-19 and the kind of economic hurdles it has now put not only on Pakistani part, but also in front of China. Can China continue with the commitments it has made in the COVID-19 situation, given the existing fault lines in terms of Pakistan's capability to kind of pull this off?
I think that's another very good question. I think that we need to unpack this a little bit more. First of all, capacity. It's one of the things capacity to implement the projects, not just at the federal level, but especially the provincial level. It's one of the things which is mentioned often in conversations that I had during fieldwork. So whether, and this was also one of the reasons behind the fact that the decision-making process was rather centralized as far as the very beginning of CPEC, we're talking about 2013, 2015, is concerned. So capacity, it's an issue, but that's something which it's being addressed and probably will grow in the coming years. As far as CPEC is concerned, I think that's the real crux of the matter right now and at the moment, for a number of reasons. Probably what we will see is that as a result of COVID-19, China will have to boost domestic consumption, and it will be more focused on that than on outward expansion. So that's one of the trends that we need to understand and keep in mind. The second one is from a Pakistani perspective and from Pakistan's point of view. What we see is that the GDP went down last year from, I think, 5% to 3.3%. The country is in austerity mode at the moment, and it has been so for the past couple of years. So it will be difficult to justify and to spend more on the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So I don't think this is a problem for the projects that are already being financed, and the ones that are under construction, that should be fine. But in terms of finding the way forward, I think that's where the negotiations or the discussions at the moment are, with the 10th Joint Cooperation Committee meeting, which should be coming up in the next few months. I think that's one of the key aspects that will be discussed. So the medium-term projection of CPEC, it's something which it will be interesting to follow for the reasons that we've just mentioned.
Yeah, sure. Just to let our audience know, I'm just reframing their questions. So these excellent.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Well, whoever is asking the questions, I mean, it's great. Thanks.
Yeah. So one of the questions we have is about the labor situation, how the CPEC kind of changes the labor situation in Pakistan, the geopolitics of labor, so to say, and the influx of Chinese workers. How has this dimension impacted not only issues around employment and state resources, but also particularly in Balochistan, so to say?
Yeah, I think that's that's another very good question. So there are two dimensions here. One is the worries and concerns that the influx of workers would sort of neglect local populations, especially in Balochistan. And I think the
No.
The concern was, okay, so that's another dimension. I think that's one side of the story. The other one is the way in which CPEC has potentially created new jobs within Pakistan. And I mean, what we saw is that according to the latest Pakistan's economic survey, CPEC has created around 75,000 direct jobs. And this sort of echoes some of the previous claims that were made in the previous years. There's one big caveat, that these sources and these figures have not really been independently verified, so it's difficult to gauge the extent to which these are. We can rely on this data to make broader generalizations as the labor situation under CPEC, but I think something's going on there. And also there were, I mean, in terms of the interaction between Chinese workers and local workers on CPEC projects, I think that there is some element of knowledge transfer and skills transfers which is occurring, and that I think will benefit in the, it's not an impact that you see tomorrow, it's something which is visible probably a bit in the medium term. So I think this would be the trends that I would highlight.
Sure. No, we have concentrated on our discussion largely on the impact of CPEC on Pakistan. I would now like to take your focus towards India, so to say. So we have a number of questions on the implications for India, which you also touched in your presentation. So the first of all is some of our audience would like to know that how the CPEC, this qualitative change in Sino-Pakistan relationship complicates India's relations with China, first of all. Both Pakistan and China have now entered in a very deeper interdependent relationship, which was not there before. And it raises stakes for both China and Pakistan to come out of the security entanglement they have been in. So in terms of, incentives for China or Pakistan to engage with India, how does that change, how does it change the incentives for both for Indian foreign policy as well as Pakistan and China?
Thanks for the question. I think that what we've seen in recent years as well as a result of CPEC is, to an extent, yes, on the one hand, the relationship has clearly deepened But at the same time, the relationship, China has been, to an extent, cautious to keep as much as possible an open door to India as far as joining the CPEC is concerned. There were reports that to sort of address India's concerns, that there were discussions about potentially renaming the economic corridor, and this was in 2017, if I'm not wrong. So the idea that I think there is an understanding that economic corridors, that greater regional integration would benefit economic corridors. But at the same time, I mean, it's a bit of hedging here. So on the one hand, of course, China's deepened its defense relationship with Pakistan. On the other hand, they've always kept a half door open to India's involvement in the project. So I think that's something which a bit of pull and push from China that we've seen, and that I think it's interesting to emphasize. So yeah, I think.
Sure. And what are the, so one of the issues between India and China has been about India's membership of the BRI. And India has repeatedly said that it is not going to join the project, particularly because of the sovereignty issues, but also issues around transparency and issues of debt for that matter. Do you think there is any, what is your reading of India's reluctance to join BRI? And has there been an active attempt from the Chinese side, so to say, to change that position which New Delhi has positioned itself into?
I think, I'm not an expert on India's foreign policy. So my sense is that, India's been very successful in placing and in being very vocal about its opposition to the BRI. And it has been very successful in doing so, especially with the United States. And I think that that's something which we've seen quite a lot. I was also reading that there are some sections of the India policymaking community who could sort of advocate the potential for a greater cooperation between China and India under the BRI framework to fund and to sort of fund some of the projects that and some of the development within India as well. I think that China probably would be inclined to endorse this kind of initiatives, but I wouldn't go farther. Again, also because I've mostly looked at the Indian side from the other side of the border, so I don't want to say things which are not particularly precise.
Sure. No, definitely. That's some of our Indian audiences wanted to know.
Sure. No, that's an excellent question, and I wish I had a more comprehensive answer.
Yeah. So the other thing which is very interesting is that with the Modi government in power, we have seen increasing altercations between India and Pakistan on the treatment of Indian Muslims. But on the other hand, India has been quick to point out Pakistani hypocrisy and not pointing out what China has been doing in Xinjiang. So the issue of Xinjiang, particularly in terms of Pakistan representing itself as the interests of Muslims worldwide, so to say, how does that go? Does it have a domestic implications in Pakistani politics, and even in terms of foreign policy? How is Pakistan dealing with that issue with China?
I think, at the domestic level, what you see is that there are a number. Every now and then some newspapers with anonymous editorials try to bring up the issue of why the Pakistani government is silent. But there are, on what's going on in Xinjiang, I think that there are two things here. One is not just Pakistan. It's something which the sort of realpolitik adopted on this specific dimension. It's not unique to Pakistan. And the second point, which might sound very obvious, but I think it's the very explanation for this. With all that's going on with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and given the long-standing relationship between the two countries, antagonizing China, it's really not an option. And I think it's as simple as that, in the sense that, and whenever Imran Khan is asked, and I'm mentioning the current prime minister, but this was the case also in under previous governments. It's by no means unique or a specificity of this one. I think that what we see is that he says that this is something that we bring up privately in bilateral exchanges. So that's the official version. What I think the explanation is, again, going against China and China's own policies, I don't think it's an option that it's even contemplated at the moment in Pakistan.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things which is very, very interesting is also that how is Pakistan dealing with the US on CPEC? So we kind of hear a lot about India's problems with CPEC, but US is a major player. And US is also quite influential to some of Pakistan's very important foreign policy partners, such as in the Middle East and all that. So what is the thinking? What is the thinking in Pakistan? Do they want to put all their eggs in one basket? And are there any debates within the foreign policy circles of what could be the side effects of doing that?
I think it's another excellent question. And one of the things that I've mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So I think there are segments of the Pakistani community that question this ever closer alliance to China. So I think this is an element which is there. But I mean, it's still a relative minority of this. Especially the chart on the defense exchanges, so the arms transfers and so on and so forth. I think that gives us a clear indication of where the priority lies as well. So yes, there are some segments which question whether it's desirable to place all the eggs in one basket, as you've put it. But at the same time, it's a relative minority, I think, which is there, but it's not predominant at the moment.
Right. So yeah, taking forward, we have a few more minutes left. We already passed time, but we can take it up to 5:10. So to say, I've got an indication from ISIS that we can take it forward to 5:10.
Wonderful.
The other thing, which is extremely interesting, and you made a point about Gwadar, and one of the case studies in your own book is Gwadar, and there is so much of skepticism in some sense, hypothesis, all kinds of hypotheses which flow around that project. And you made a point that at this point in time, the militarization of Gwadar doesn't seem to be the case. But there's always this idea of what you can do tomorrow. And I remember Xi Jinping basically saying in the first half of 2010s that the artificial islands they were creating in South China Sea will never be militarized. And today you have all kinds of military paraphernalia in those islands. And that has generated a lot of skepticism world over. What was your feeling when you went to Pakistan and China and talked about Gwadar as such, and where this could be heading, so to say? But the Gwadar has still not materialized. So if you could comment upon Gwadar from your own studies, that would be great.
I think I think you're absolutely right. And in the sense that, at times we saw things unfolding in later years quite differently from what was originally announced. But I think I can't read into the future. So it's just a matter of trying to read this in the wider context of the BRI. True, on the one hand, China has built its first base in Djibouti, but joining other Western countries which have their bases there. At the same time, I think that especially now that the biggest propaganda push under the BRI is going on, whether it's face mask diplomacy, if you like, or whether it's the sanitary belt and road, whatever you may call it, I think, and given that Gwadar has been at the very heart of discussions of the BRI, the string on pearls, and so on and so forth, I don't think it's on the cards as of now to do something like that. It would send a signal across the other countries which are part of the initiative that, well, look, those who are against it and those who were saying that it's an imperialistic endeavor were essentially right. So I don't think that that's something which is, again, happening now. At the same time, of course, it's being developed. Slowly but steadily, it's being developed. So the question mark, I think it's always there, and it's gonna be there, but I just don't see it happening now or in the next few months. We watched this video 10 years down the line. I may be proven completely wrong. I don't know, but from the data that we have at the moment, I don't think that's something which is happening.
Sure. Just the last question, and I'm just paraphrasing one of the questions which have been put by some of our audience. So one of the things which is interesting, and as you rightly point out in the introductory chapter, as I was reading through your book, is about the comparative analysis using one case study, one intense case study, which you do in your book for Chinese for the BRI project all over Asia, so to say. And how do you think, are there parallels or are there implications, conclusions which could inform from your study of CPEC, which could inform the BRI project as it has been handled, all over Asia, so to say? Are there any conclusions and lessons which we can learn for the whole of BRI from CPEC?
That's another very good question to conclude the fantastic range of questions that were asked today. I think that yes, there are a number of things that we can learn. One is that I think we really need to bring into the discussion this idea of the agency of the recipient countries. What I hope that my presentation did today, and in general what I tried to do in the book, was really to bring out and to unearth how the domestic, we should not interpret the BRI as something which gets parachuted in recipient countries and then it goes on. There is an element of interactions between among a wide range of stakeholders. So Chinese stakeholders as well need to interact, or at least they need that the ones on the ground do not go against their own interests. So it's a very complex combination of interests. So that's the first thing, a better understanding of the BRI along different lines than the ones that we've seen, that we've read it through so far. But I think it's difficult to sort of, this would be my main point. It's also very difficult, I think, to generalize as far as the BRI is concerned, because it brings together Southeast Asia, South Asia. Now it's going very quickly into the Middle East, Europe. And I think that what really needs to be done in general is to bring together different experiences of different countries. Malaysia has a very different experience than Pakistan. Sri Lanka had a different experience than Pakistan and Malaysia. So I think we really need to bring together the depths of each case study and try to find the broader picture. So I don't want to generalize too much from the Pakistani case, because each individual interaction has its own specificities, I think, which we need to appreciate.
Sure. I'm not going to conclude by making extensive remarks on what has been a very exciting, past 1 hour or 10 minutes, with you giving such amazing insights of your work on the Sino-Pakistani relationship, the CPEC, its implications for India, its implications not only for Pakistani foreign policy, but also its domestic economic policy, so to say, how it kind of, interspersed with different interest groups within Pakistani polity, but also its implications for world over, so to say. So this has been extremely exciting. It has been extremely illuminating, and I thank you so much for joining us on this webinar, which I think would now be the routine as we are all under lockdown in this very extreme situation, so to say. And thanks to everyone who has joined us from all over the world. And I would urge you to keep joining us at ISIS webinars as we unfold our new way of connecting with our audience world over, and to kind of disseminate ideas and ruminate over some of these very interesting, and complicated issues, especially in the situation we are in. So thank you so much. Thank you for everyone to have joined us, and all the best for you with your future work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thanks ISAS, and thanks Dr. Joshi for moderating the discussion. I mean, it's been a real pleasure. Wonderful questions, a lot of things to think about going ahead. So thank you so much, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.